early morning following our late evening last night and sets of discussions therein that explored the kind of early phases of Western American history from a variety of vantage points. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to be moderating this morning's session that turns more specifically to the 19th century American West and does so from the vantage points of three remarkably capable, insightful writers, authors, and scholars. Professor Virginia Scharf to my left, Hampton Sides, and Stephen Woodworth. We're going to start with Virginia and ask her to kind of help us kind of connect some of the themes that we were introducing yesterday. We'll continue to explore this morning, and hopefully will animate subsequent conversations throughout the morning and weekend ahead. The theme of this session is particularly focused on the pressures that built and the stakes that enlarged kind of American Western expansion following the Louisiana Purchase in the early 19th century, and the kind of role of particularly American statesmen and explorers in that process of pressure and stake building. So, Virginia, what do you think of when you hear these themes, and particularly this kind of phrase, Horace Mann's "Go West, young man"?
Well, a couple of things. So my work has mostly been on what Ned might have called, or in Ned's phrase of yesterday, the unintelligibility of vast spans of our past. And what I mean by that is all of the things that have either been ignored or suppressed or erased or obscured or distorted, and how we read the evidence that we have and develop new forms of evidence to understand things that seem familiar. So I will give you an example of this. I have spent, I want to say, either 10 or 35 years studying Thomas Jefferson. Or possibly more years than that, because I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and in the Jefferson Memorial, which is now the Missouri Historical Society, where you may have been, which is some of my earliest memories are of going to that memorial. And I remember, if you all, have any of you been to the Missouri History Museum here? Okay, yeah, Steve Aaron raises his hand. Thank you, Steve. Well, there's a huge seated statue of Thomas Jefferson there. And one of my earliest memories is of a huge, huge snowstorm in St. Louis. And we used to go to the Forest Park and go sledding in Art Hill. Marnie Sandweiss knows about this because we grew up in the same place and went to Sunday school together. And this enormous snowstorm, and I remember going sledding, and then my mom volunteered at the History Museum, and there was a giant snowdrift up to Jefferson himself, and I climbed up this snowdrift and sat in his lap. And I thought, and of course, my mom came out there, "What are you doing?" freaking out. Of course, parents used to leave their kids outside to do whatever in public places. But I just, so I've always had this kind of connection to the story of Thomas Jefferson. But of course, the more you know about Jefferson, the more complicated his legacy is. So when we talk about the Louisiana Purchase and this phrase, "Go West, young man," what did Jefferson intend the space that he purchased with the stroke of a pen, almost by accident, what did he think it should look like? And I think what he intended it to be, and I wrote a book called The Women Jefferson Loved, and people, the joke is, "Oh, I bet there were a lot of them, kind of thing." But in fact, what Jefferson had is a very clear picture of what he thought the ideal society should look like. And it was pretty much Virginia in the 18th and early 19th century. That's what he thought it should be. He thought it should be little freestanding patriarchal households from sea to shining sea. Farms, right? Plantations, right? So some of it is about the idea of all men being created equal, and the young man of Go West, young man is a man who votes and is white and is land holding and property holding. But in fact, what it entails is a whole set of intimate relationships, political relationships that depend on the idea of these freestanding freeholds where these men basically exercise their authority on behalf of and in protection of and in dominance over all of the people who live there, some of them white, some of them not, some of them slave, and some of them not enslaved. So we have to really see all of those people in that picture in order for us to understand the kind of complex history that we're going to be talking about, because the fact of Jefferson writing the phrase, all men are created equal, he didn't mean that for women. He certainly didn't mean it for enslaved people. He did not mean that for the indigenous people who occupied the land that he had just purchased and thought of as being open to settlement, although he knew very well that it was not empty. And so try to populate the West with people before the young man goes west. Try to see all of those diverse people that Ned talked about and that everybody has been talking about who were already there. And what I would say is try to imagine that some of those people are women, because I think seeing women in history makes history look different. Try to imagine the hunting and gathering societies that we talked about yesterday, and the idea that gathering is, as Ned pointed out yesterday, gathering goes right straight through to the present among indigenous people. 80% of nutrition in hunting and gathering cultures comes from gathering, and that's mostly women's work. And so when that young man goes west, I want you to imagine him not as a lone cowboy going into empty space, being exhausted, setting his head down on his saddle, falling asleep and waking up in empty space, but instead being awakened in that morning by women all around him talking and gathering. Rethink the West from the point of view of all of the people who are there, and rethink the West from the point of view of the kind of settlement that guys like Jefferson intended. They're going to be young men out there doing lots of things. I think Hampton has certainly written about some of them. But try to get a different picture in your head and imagine people already there looking to the east, seeing that young man come over the horizon.
Very well put. And if we were to think of kind of particularly prominent, popular, varied experiences of young men in the early American West, perhaps none more embodies this period in time than a young Missourian that, Hampton, you've written about in some capacity and an extraordinary flair, whom we'll hear about later this evening. But perhaps you can preempt us with a few insights into the kind of nature of the world in which either Kit Carson himself was raised or the world in which he kind of established and created when he left Missouri for his new homes in the American West.
Yeah, Missouri is the point of departure, and it's interesting that you're from St. Louis, right. Virginia. It's the place where all these expeditions were mounted from, the Fremont expeditions. It's the place where the Santa Fe Trail ended in Independence, Missouri. It's the place where Senator Thomas Hart Benton was from, and he's a very, very important person to sort of understand the rapid expansion of the West. Senator Benton was a very strong-willed, very articulate, somewhat megalomaniac senator from Missouri who was famous for his three-day filibusters and all sorts of, he had the best library both east and west of the Mississippi River, supposedly. But he was a great believer in the idea of manifest destiny before manifest destiny was even a term yet. And he had read a lot of sort of the histories of the world, and he believed that all the great empires had to have commerce with China and India, and that the United States would never become a great empire unless we had ports on the Pacific in order to trade with China and India. And in order to have ports on the Pacific, we needed to have trails leading through this continent. He didn't particularly want all the continent so much as he wanted those ports on the Pacific. So he was writing and pontificating in the Senate for years during this period when young men like Kit Carson were coming up. And Kit Carson was orphaned at a young age and had to work as an apprentice for a saddle maker in Missouri, and hated this close, tedious work of working on saddles and with these little crimping tools, and it was just so boring. He was a teenager, bored out of his mind. But then these guys who had been west would come down the newly opened Santa Fe Trail, would come in to buy stuff, and these were greasy, grizzled, hairy, big old guys, many of them Frenchmen. Sometimes they spoke Spanish. Sometimes they were half-breed Indians. They were just exotic, interesting, cool people to this teenager with an imagination running wild. And so he ran away from his apprenticeship. And he broke the law, and he headed west down the newly opened Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail had opened primarily as a trade route between Santa Fe and Independence because of, after Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, the territories, the southwestern territories, Mexico, New Mexico, needed a trading partner. And they were beginning to sort of sever their relationship with Spain and even to a certain extent with Mexico City in favor of goods that were coming from Missouri and coming from the United States. The tools, for one thing, the basic things like hammers and nails and shovels and so forth. So this very brisk and interesting kind of trade developed on the Santa Fe Trail in the 1820s. Kit Carson came west on that trail. That artery is a really important thing to understand in terms of just little by little how it brought these two cultures together, sometimes in concord, as we talked about last night, and sometimes in conflict. But Carson came down it, immediately made his way to Taos, where he hooked up with some of these other greasy, grizzled, hirsute mountain men. Taos was the sort of the southern capital of the fur trade, and he kind of came late to the party of being a mountain man that was still going on, but was in its waning years. Partly because the mountain men were so good at trapping beaver, they actually led very quickly to the extinction of beaver in a lot of these creeks and tributaries. But he came to the party late, but with a vengeance. He ended up being one of the most famous mountain men of all. He trapped with some of the great ones. He went to a lot of these rendezvous, and he came to know and love the West. And I think it's really important to understand why the mountain men are so vital in opening the West. And it has partly to do with the fact that in the West, the only way to really unlock this dry, arid territory is to understand the rivers. Mm-hmm. And that's all the mountain men did, is followed the rivers and the creeks. That's where the beavers were. And in this kind of terrain, if you don't know where the rivers are, you're dead within days. So these guys had sort of this intuitive understanding of the West that many people didn't have, because they knew the rivers. And so when the beaver trade kind of the bottom dropped out of the whole thing, that was discussed last night by Mr. Koch, Mr. Koch. But Kit Carson was sort of out of work, and so he somehow miraculously intersected with a cat named John C. Fremont, who was an explorer and the son-in-law of the aforementioned Thomas Hart Benton. And he had these amazing assignments to go west, to map and explore the West, and to sort of describe the flora and fauna of the West in the 1840s. And he needed a scout, he needed a guide, someone who knew the river systems. And who was that person? It was Kit Carson. And I'll sort of end there for now, but that's when Kit Carson became kind of a household name in the United States, because John C. Fremont mentioned him in his journals, which became best-selling books, and ignited ultimately this migration west of people who are interested in the West along the Oregon Trail and along the Santa Fe Trail. So, Kit Carson 101.
Well, we're looking forward to the AP course this evening. We'll find out likely this evening that Carson plays a very central role in the crucible that we called it last night of the Civil War. And it's not entirely clear why a Missourian might side with the Union, given the kind of loyalties and divisions that characterized that state both before as well as during the Civil War itself. The most, I think, bloody kind of internal Civil War was fought in Missouri, as our next presenter, Stephen Woodworth, is very keenly aware and knowledgeable about. Stephen, what do you think when you hear about these kind of early 19th and antebellum kind of figures and histories and the kind of coming of the Civil War era?
Right, that's a good question. The Civil War is not as much fought in the West as it's caused by the West, right. And there's a reason for that. What happens in the West has these tremendous reverberations back, and it relates to slavery. Now, I would say that relatively few slaves actually wound up going west. Now, of course, already in Mr. Jefferson's administration, we have a slave, I think he's a slave, William Clark's slave servant, who goes all the way to the Pacific coast with the Lewis and Clark expedition. But that's unusual. That's someone who's a very trusted slave. And what will tend to happen as far as the frontier is concerned, when an area is unsettled and unstable, slaveholders will be reluctant to bring any other slaves than that very trusted individual, that one that they feel they can trust who will not run away. Slaves were a tremendously valuable investment. By the 1840s or 50s, a slave would bring, maybe $1,000 or more. And that was a lot of money back then. So we're talking, it's an investment almost on the level of a major piece of farm equipment. Obviously it's a human being, so it's not the same thing. But in terms of economics, there's that huge investment. Only this is not, this is like the farmer's combine if it had a mind of its own and its own soul and a desire to be free and would run away. And slaves will. And in an unstable or unsettled type frontier environment, it would be all too easy for slaves to do that and to escape. And so there's a tendency for slaveholders not to bring large numbers of slaves west initially, but they're very interested in the West because the West is the future and the West is federal. It's the future, obviously, because there's going to be future states there. Those future states are going to vote. They will potentially be able to ratify or block the ratification of constitutional amendments. And the West is federal, that is, it's controlled by Congress. It's easy to overlook now. We tend to, so often doing history, it's hard to avoid taking the present and projecting it back into the past and thinking the past must have been just like that. And one thing that's different is that during that time, before the Civil War, everyone, almost literally everyone, I know we shouldn't talk in absolutes, maybe there was somebody somewhere who didn't, but virtually everyone accepted, whether you were bitterly opposed to slavery or whether you were an all-out advocate of slavery, everyone agreed the federal government could not do anything about slavery in a state where it existed. Slavery in South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, you name it, the federal government couldn't touch it. And so that just wasn't up for grabs. And often I'll have students ask me, well, why didn't they do something, why didn't they get rid of slavery in the states where it existed instead of fighting about the territories? Because the federal government couldn't do anything about those states. So the West, as territories, was where you could fight about slavery. And so it's interesting, the West becomes this football, and it becomes this thing that's fought over. People sometimes say, well, they're fighting over an abstraction because you couldn't take slaves there anyway. Well, you certainly could. And slaves could have done things in the West. They were quite capable of mining work and other things like that. But the West has this, here, not so much who is there and who is doing things, but who is back east thinking of the West and what they could do with it and what it could become and what its potential might be to change the course of the whole country and the institution of slavery.
You know, I've never thought about the kind of imperatives to restrict slavery from the territories in those degrees. And that kind of almost further underscores the kind of theme of this session about young white men heading west, those without property, without those types of investments, constituting these newly forming communities. Virginia, do you think the West caused the Civil War in the ways that Steve just said? Or I know there's a session
Yeah,
on the
we're
Civil
going
War
to get
later.
to that, I think. I think what I want to do is to try to unpack a little bit of that, the conversation about slavery in the places where it already existed, which has a history of its own. And so by 1832, there's a debate in the Virginia legislature where it's really the last time slavery is publicly debated in Virginia. After that, there's a kind of gag rule that happens. So, we have a moment there where up until about 1832, there is still a lot of debate about what should happen under the circumstances that, as slavery is abolished, what should happen to people, formerly enslaved people, whether people who considered to other people to be their property should be compensated for the loss of that valuable property. So there's a lot of conversation about that before, but I think you have to think about also a question that's really important in terms of the values that come. And we talked about values a lot yesterday. I thought that Mark Varian's answer to Sarah's question about, how shall we think about these things with relevance to our own lives? What are the values that come along? And it has to do with who counts as an American citizen and where counts as places where people are entitled to the privileges and immunities of the United States and the citizenship that entitles you to those things. So those are questions that are gonna be on the table, right? Should formerly enslaved people, if they're emancipated, be entitled to full citizenship? Should women have any of those privileges and immunities? Should Native people ever be capable of citizenship? I will tell you that, we talked about, it's interesting, Ned talked about why Colorado kind of tries to pretend that New Mexico doesn't exist, or why Colorado history is so often seen in isolation from New Mexico. And there's serious reasons for that that have to do with understandings about race and culture in the West. So New Mexico has long settled communities, sedentary communities of people who are descendants of Spanish and Indian peoples in New Mexico who were there. And so there's almost a kind of, New Mexico is a strange place, right? An unusual place in the West. So we have to be thinking with race when we think about citizenship, with gender, with culture, as we think about what Go West Young Man meant for all of these different inhabitants. So, your point is so well taken, but, the deeper we get into the history, and there's a whole bunch of books out there that are available to all of you. All of our books are there, You can see a lot of different evidence there for a lot of different pieces of this discussion, I think.
Can I add just a little something about slavery? I think that it's sort of one of the dirty little secrets of New Mexico and of the West, that there was another form of slavery that was already going on, completely separate from the American South and the sort of monoculture plantation system. In New Mexico, especially along the Rio Grande, there was this several hundred-year history of raids. The Native Americans would raid and steal sheep and cattle and women and children, and the Spanish would reciprocate in kind. And this sort of metronome back and forth of stealing each other's women and children and sheep and cattle had gone on for so long. And slaves were sold at the auction, on the auction block in places like Taos and Santa Fe. And it's, you know, any family, Spanish family, Mexican family in New Mexico with any means had Indian slaves, both inside, you know, domestics and outside working in the fields along the Rio Grande. And it's just something that and I'm from New Mexico, and Virginia's from New Mexico. We don't really talk about much in New Mexico. It's a kind of a uncomfortable truth, and another little wrinkle in this larger story of slavery and who gets to be a full-fledged citizen in this West.
Well, and I would just add to that that form of unfree labor persists right through and into and after the Civil War. So we have, you know, evidence of people who are, you know, captured, but then in some way integrated into families, more or less, or maybe never integrated, and lots of evidence of that in all kinds of records in New Mexico. And it's interesting to think about New Mexico, strange and weird as it is, does not become a state until 1912.
Yeah, the oldest permanently settled European colony in North America.
Well, and then there's another reason for that, which is that it really took a long time for people to understand what the value was of certain parts of the extremely dry West. If you couldn't farm it, what value did it have? Well, maybe mining. Well, if it didn't have good mining, what value did it have? It really took almost many years later, like the environmental movement and great painters and great photographers, for us to finally recognize that the West was truly magical and truly beautiful and truly valuable in other senses besides just economic.
Yep, just to comment on something that Virginia said, the 1832 state of Virginia emancipation debate. And there's something that intrigues me about this period of history as compared to a decade, 2 or 3 later, which I study more, as to how relatively fluid and still maybe malleable, maybe there's potential there. I think there's a difference between, you know, when someone has not been faced with a question, and maybe we know that that person has assumptions which will probably lead him to do wrong. Maybe we know, we study the future, and he did make the wrong decision, but he hasn't been asked the question yet. It's just an assumption, and he hasn't really faced that, or she, or whoever it is, you know, hasn't really faced that decision. Versus when they've been faced with that, they've been challenged with, here is this situation, you need to do the right thing. No, I won't. I'm not going to do the right thing. And at that point, there comes a hardening. And I see this, of course, with the slavery issue, whereas in the 1820s and up to the early 30s, maybe there was a willingness to continue thinking in the way they had at the time of the founding, that maybe slavery is going to go away of its own, or maybe we need to give it just a little bit of a shove. And I think with other things, who's an American and who's an American citizen? And we say, well, obviously these people thought, and it was only whites, maybe only white males or something, I don't know. Well, I think there was also a degree to which some of those questions had not been faced yet. And I think they hadn't really answered. And I think, well, I'm actually reading your book about Kit Carson, and I find it seems like he's confronted with situations, and he hasn't confronted that yet. What should he do? Wow, what do I do about this situation? And then, of course, unfortunately, Fremont comes along and tells him something to do, and that's probably not the right thing to do. But you know, that moment where we face it and think, I really haven't confronted that before. And you know, in my own life, over my 57 years, having come to a few times where, oh, I didn't confront that issue before, you know, and sometimes you feel like the film Driving Miss Daisy, you feel like Miss Daisy at the end where she comes up and she says, I didn't do right. You know, where you haven't really thought about this. You haven't thought about what the rights and wrongs of it yet. And that's an era of history when that seems to be the lot of many Americans.
Well, it's very clear that 19th century Western American history has so many dimensions and kind of points of engagement to provide. And we have a kind of short amount of time to begin a short set of questions if anyone in the audience has them. There are mics that are being carried around if anyone wants to kind of respond to or kind of inquire more fully about this kind of percolating set of topics and conversations.
I keep hearing about the Santa Fe Trail. Tell us more about it. Was it the paved road? What exactly was it? And what did it look like? Tell us. You keep talking about it. What was it physically like?
The Santa Fe Trail it still exists in parts and pieces, and you can actually see the ruts in the road in places in Kansas and Missouri and elsewhere. There are places that supposedly you can see it from a satellite, or the photographs. There are satellite photographs of some of the ruts. It was an important road in the 1820s and 30s. This was, an arduous journey of months, with oxen and sometimes mules. People were attacked by Indians, particularly the Comanches, along the way. But it was a very important artery for commerce, and it was also the sort of highway that the American Army, the Army of the West, used when it came to New Mexico in 1846 to conquer the West. And so the same avenue that was used for commerce was used for military purposes as well. With the coming of the railroad, it diminished in importance and then finally sort of petered out when about the 1880s, I guess.
Yeah, after the railroad comes. So if you want to really get a visceral understanding of what it was like to travel the Santa Fe Trail, I would recommend to you a book by Susan Shelby McGoffin, who went west in 1846 with Kearny's army, called Down the Santa Fe Trail and into Mexico. This was her diary, and she was an 18-year-old new bride who was pregnant on that trail.
And a great writer.
And an amazing writer, this kid, right? But I mean, you feel every bump, every rock, the carriage overturns at one point, this horrific carriage crash. Then she's riding in a wagon that her enslaved maid was along with her. The maid rode in the wagon. Now she's riding with the enslaved maid. And so that's, a big wake up for her. That's a confronting of something you never thought you would do before. She ends up miscarrying at Bent's Fort because of the rigors of that travel down the trail. And what she meets and who she encounters all along the way, it's a stunning document. I really recommend it. It's still in print. And if you like those kind of frontier memoirs, it's a really good one. Susan Shelby McGoffin, Magoffin. She was a young Kentucky bride, goes all the way down into Mexico, has this really, difficult time. Along the trail, you really get a kind of nightmare sense of, entering into the domain of war, which is what's happening at that point. And then, her health is so compromised by this that she dies shortly thereafter, and her husband, Samuel McGoffin, marries another woman named Susan Shelby McGoffin.
Yeah, I think it's important also to mention that this road from Independence to Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Trail, then in turn connects with the Camino Real, which leads all the way to Mexico City. And it's a major trade route. For goods like tools and I don't know what sorts of things were coming from Missouri were then traded here for Navajo blankets and furs and all kinds of stuff from Mexico City. So it was an important road for about 40 years or so in our history.
Stations every so often?
Yes.
Stations?
Yes, there were stations along the way. Not very many, though. It was a very rough way to go, and these wagon trains were huge and well armed, and they had to be.
Do we have time for one more question? A couple more.
In the late 1900s and the very early part of the 2000s, if you will, there was a great deal of romanticized literature that attracted people to the West. And certainly the railroad's influence on that, bringing artists to capture images like the one right behind you, was again a part of what brought people out. Is there evidence in this early period, 1800, 1840, of the same romanticism that would drive people from the east to the west to fill up that great open country?
Well, we saw some of those wonderful images last night of the Alfred Jacob Miller paintings that Mr. Koch has, and I am really excited to see those paintings because it's a dazzling array of stuff from Miller that I haven't seen. Really, by 1860s or so, you've really got people like Thomas Moran, George Catlin had been painting in the West, and they would go with some of the expeditions to the West. So you would have an artist. I mean, Fremont took, what's his name, the cartographer?
brothers, those
Royce,
brothers,
Charles Royce, who was his cartographer who, I mean, the maps themselves, and I think Steve Aaron mentioned he wanted to talk more about maps. But maps themselves are in some ways a kind of romantic rendering. So if you see a map that looks like, I can follow that river and I can maybe have a farm there and I can do that kind of thing, those maps erase as much as they depict. So, I think your question opens up an enormous terrain of what are the visual representations that, that we make in order to achieve the ends and fulfill the values that we have.
I think we have time for one more question, though we have two hands up, but maybe two more.
Thomas Hart Benton, Sr., can you talk a little more about his feelings on slavery? I know how his son felt, but how about him, the senator?
Senator,
Nephew.
no, he was the uncle of the painter, a great uncle, I think. Thomas Hart Benton, I'm certainly no expert on him, but his views on slavery were complicated. He liked everything to do with Missouri and slavery. Let's see, he was not an abolitionist by any case, and he had slaves of his own, I believe.
He did.
But he didn't believe that. Help me out here. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated. He's one of these guys, I almost put Zachary Taylor somewhat in the same category of these sort of almost a extinct species still around, sort of a relic of an earlier time. They have slaves. Yeah, we can't really get rid of slavery, but it's not really good. We don't want it to spread. We don't want it to spread to new territories. So he didn't want slavery to spread. And in that sense, he was almost free soil. But he actually owned slaves himself. His son-in-law and his daughter, John C. Fremont.
Abolitionists.
Right. John C. Fremont's the first presidential candidate of the Republican Party on a platform of no further spread of slavery. So he's not an abolitionist, but he's against the spread of slavery, even though he's not for immediate abolition.
And Fremont, when he is head of this is getting ahead to the Civil War again, but when he's head of the Department of Missouri, issues the first Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln is furious about this because he says, this is premature. We're going to alienate the slaveholders in Missouri. We need to hang on to Missouri. Jessie Benton Fremont, Fremont's wife and Benton's daughter, takes a train from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. to try to persuade Lincoln that they're doing the right thing. And Lincoln says to her, "You're quite a lady politician, aren't you?" And sends her on her way.
And there's another woman, and we don't think it's this male story, but there's all these amazing women who are starting to get more and more recognized in the literature, I think.
Jessie Benton Fremont is one of the most amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really productive conversation this morning. We look forward to the subsequent sessions, both shortly hereafter and throughout the day. Can everyone join me in giving our panelists a round of applause?